Good morning, everybody out there in Hell Yeah PG Facebook land. This is the Exploration Place. We are just logging on to do our live session for today with head keeper Sabrina. Who have you got there, Sabrina?
This is Hugo.
Hey, we're back to the garter snakes for today.
Star of the show.
Now, you told me we've got something different we're doing today.
Yeah, so once in a while, just to give a little bit of variety, we will mix up the prey items. Normally we feed these guys frozen and thawed rats and mice, but in the wild, their primary food sources are aquatic things like fish, frogs, tadpoles, stuff like that. So we are actually going to go ahead and try and feed them some fish today. They usually eat them pretty good. Sometimes they need a little bit of help finding where they are because it's not what they're typically used to. So let's see. Usually Hugo is a pretty good at fishing, so we'll get her in there. And if she has trouble eating them, I might be able to help her. We've also got the males here, and the males are usually fairly proficient fishers, so we'll wait and see.
So in the wild, they would just find minnows in creeks.
Yeah, so garter snakes are actually closely, look at her, she's too interested in this bin. Garter snakes are closely related to water snakes, so they are very proficient hunters in the water. They can hold their breath for a long time, and they're very agile in the water. Not like a lot of other snakes who can't necessarily swim super well. They are very good at it. So.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know they could hold their breath.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, we'll often have people point out, like, I think your snake drowned, because they'll be sitting under the water with their heads underneath, completely submerged, but they can do that for quite a while without having to come up for air. So I think it's like 6 minutes or something like that garter snakes can hold their breath.
Wow, that is a long time.
So.
And these are just little feeder goldfish?
Yeah, these are just little feeder fish from the store. Definitely, when we do feed fish, you actually want to try to avoid goldfish for the most part. So I don't feed goldfish very often, just because if you continue to feed goldfish, are you not going to get these, or do you want something different? If you continue to feed goldfish too often to these guys, they can develop nutritional deficiencies. So you want to make sure that you are giving them a lot of variety in their diet, which is why we started adding a couple of different things. Minnows are another good thing you can feed them. Now sometimes they call these guys minnows because they're small, but what we say when we mean minnows is live-bearing fish like endlers, guppies, things like that.
Live-bearing fish meaning they don't lay eggs?
They don't lay eggs. They give birth to live babies, and those guys don't have the, look, there they are. They're under the water. Sometimes it takes them a little while. We'll get a couple more of them out. We'll see if one of them will inspire the others to eat.
That's true. Then it becomes a race to try and feed.
You have to watch them. Bubba specifically gets super aggressive and will try to go after the other snakes. So I don't feed her along with the others ever. Put all the boys in here and see if any of them.
See if anybody's interested.
Sometimes I have to use the feeding tongs to point the fish out as well.
Is that why you've got them in a black container, so the contrast is better
Hopefully
for them?
they would see better. Usually I put the dark-colored fish in a light container and the light-colored fish in a darker container. But their vision isn't that great to begin with, so a lot of the time they have to go and smell. And
that'd be tough underwater.
Yeah, so usually they'll get to the dish and then they just start jarring their heads in and trying to find the fish. Which is what it looks like they're getting ready to do now. I think that they know that it's feeding time, but they're confused because they're so used to the rodents.
Right.
I'll bring Hugo out too.
So this is all the boys we have out right now, correct?
Yeah, we've got... This is Legs here. He's the biggest. This is Arms. He looks almost exactly like Legs, but he's smaller. And then this here is Crazy Eye.
Now, how do we come up with names like Legs and Arms? Those are some silly names.
Arms and Legs didn't have names for a long time, and then two of our staff members, Jaden and Jasper, thought that Arms and Legs would make hilarious names for them. So.
Oh, that seems like a Jaden and Jasper
It's perfect.
approach.
Oh, I miss those guys.
We miss everybody in here. It's so strange to just be us.
Look, Hugo, there's fish in here. So I'm wondering if I point them out with the tongs, if Hugo will realize that they're here.
So talking about garters again, these guys you told us last time give live birth, correct?
They do.
Do the water snakes they're related to do the same thing?
Some species do. Some species don't, so it depends on which type, but a few species do also give live birth. All garter snakes give live birth.
How common is that for snakes?
Very uncommon. I think it's about 25% of snakes that give live birth.
Oh, interesting.
Most reptiles and amphibians, obviously, they're all confused. Most reptiles and amphibians obviously lay eggs. But there are some others, like we mentioned, that some chameleons give live birth. Skinks actually have developed a placental birth method. So they actually give birth like mammals. They have a placenta, which no other reptiles or amphibians tend to do. There's another species of snake that does that as well, but it's not common.
Interesting.
So you guys are not finding the fish today. Normally, I put them in a very large bin, but I thought this would be easier for them because sometimes they'll have trouble finding them like that too. I'm wondering if they just don't want fish today.
Could be.
It's hard to say.
They're so preoccupied with it being spring, even if the rest of us are freezing in the snow out there. These particular snakes are very into it being spring.
There we go. I think Hugo realizes what's going on now. Let's get your tail, buddy. Yeah, see, she's opening her mouth.
Now she's hunting.
And she's just going to flail around until she can corner one. You're going to want to get out of the way, Crazy Eye, because she's going to... Oh, she grabbed one.
There we go.
She's going to think you're a fish, Crazy Eye. Get out of here. So yeah, like I said, they don't have super good vision. They actually will feel for vibrations in the water. So once they smell the fish, they'll get into the water. And then once they have gotten in the water, they'll just kind of open their mouth and swim around. We were calling them shark noodles with the kids last time because they just like flail around with their mouths open trying to catch the fish. Good job, Hugo. Do you want more than one? She might even think that there was only one in there, but usually she's pretty proficient. Once she catches one, she will go after another.
It was neat. She got right under the water and started just hunting.
Yeah, it's super cool, especially if you have quite a few fish in there, because sometimes they'll just go crazy going around trying to catch them, and sometimes I guess how hungry they are, how big the fish are as well, things like that. Hugo, do you want more?
Hugo's been hanging out in her water dish a lot in her tank lately.
Yeah, so in the springtime, garter snakes naturally will hang out near the water for two reasons. One is that they know that they're more likely to catch food, so it's a natural instinct for them to hang out near the water where tadpoles and frogs and things will be hanging out in the spring. And also because during the winter time when they are in brumation, they are not eating or drinking, so they actually become super dehydrated. So when they wake up in the spring, their first instinct is to go hang out near water so that they can get that hydration back up, and plus they will be closer to a nearby food source. I'm gonna take these crazy boys out. We can give them some mice in a minute.
Yeah. Brumation is hibernation?
Yeah, so brumation is just the term you would use for reptiles and amphibians when they are in hibernation. And that looks different for all species, depending on where they are. So geographic location plays a part, species plays a part, obviously.
I think she might be hunting again.
Look at her go, don't bite your own tail.
So she just tries to corner them. Does she?
Yeah, basically she opens her mouth and feels around for anything that's moving. And when she notices something that's moving, she will try to pursue it. And she'll just keep her mouth open and hope that something will go in there. And as soon as it does, she'll close her mouth.
Kind of like a fish weir.
Yeah, exactly.
So our indigenous forefathers did all of that.
And you have to be a little bit careful when you're taking them out of the water, just because your finger is going to make them think it's a fish.
Right. Once they're in hunting mode?
Yes. But again, I mean, when you're feeding snakes, they are not the most intelligent. And because they don't have super good vision, they'll often just eat whatever comes near them. So you definitely have to be careful if you are feeding snakes that you watch what you're doing with your hands.
Well, and this would be enrichment for these animals too.
It is. So normally I would say live feeding is not something I recommend with any animal. But especially because these garter snakes, Hugo here is wild caught, and the others are all only one generation away from the wild caught snakes. They're the first generation of tufted red snakes that we have here. And you can actually see sometimes. The cool thing is that because they can hold their breath, they still stick out that extendable windpipe, but oftentimes they'll just hold their breath while they're eating and they'll keep their heads underwater, so they don't even necessarily need to use that all the time.
And she does that chewing motion with the
She does.
fish.
She does do that with the fish. And what we talked about before, they are a rear-fanged venomous snake. So what she's doing basically is subduing the fish. The venom that they have that is secreted from a gland in the back of their jaw, they actually have to kind of chew it in because it doesn't come out of their teeth the way it does with like a viper. So when she's pursuing the fish and she grabs onto them, she'll immediately start pulling them to the back of her mouth to chew on them, and that's because that's getting that venom into their system, and what that does is actually numbs and paralyzes the fish, so they're basically just like going to sleep. They can't move. It makes it easier for her to eat them that way.
And they have the jaw that splits as well, correct?
They do. So actually, I think right over here. There it is. This is a good visual for that. Now this is a venomous snake here, but it shows the same. The jaw structure is the same. So if you look, this bone sticking out the side here and this other bone sticking out the side here, those are actually the bottom jaw bones. So that shows just how far apart they can spread, and they can move independently like that. So this piece here that's kind of holding them together is just a chunk of cartilage, and that can stretch way out.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's splayed open like that. That's the actual jawbone that normally would just be under their upper jaw.
Yeah, like just like her bottom of her chin here, if you look, can actually spread out just like that. So
is that ever interesting?
It's super neat. So the majority of the structure that holds their face together is muscles and ligaments rather than a bone structure.
Right.
Are you all done, Hugo?
Yeah, now she's just hanging out in her cold tub.
Yeah, she'd probably eat a couple more, but I don't necessarily know if she needs to. We'll see if I'm gonna give the others some rats, and if any of them want to eat fish, that'll be all right. If they don't, then that's fine. Hugo's gonna try. Hugo's actually not the worst. If she realizes it's my hand coming towards her, she won't try to bite me. Hugo's only ever bitten me once, and as soon as she realized it was a finger and not a fish, she just let go right away. So
she's been with us a long time. She wasn't all that big when we wound up with her. So
yeah, it's funny because she's got the best personality, I find, of all of our garter snakes. I mean, they're all great, but she's definitely the most docile and the most willing to be handled and to be out for a very long time around large groups of kids and things like that. But she's the one who was wild caught, so she was born out in the wild and adapted to her life here. Whereas these guys were born here, but they're not quite as agreeable, and they often just want to do their own thing. So it's funny how their personalities definitely between these 5 snakes, they're all very different. And a lot of times people ask me how you tell them apart, and there are some appearance things, but sometimes it's just what they're doing. I can tell which snake it is based on that.
Just from body language. Now, someone named Brad is asking, where did you get a wandering garter?
So, the one we showed before, Hugo, this is Bubba. Bubba and the males are all related. They came from a female that was brought to us. I think somebody thought she was injured or sick or something like that, but what actually was going on was that she was gravid, so she was pregnant and she was about to give birth. She had a ton of babies here. We released the mom and most of the babies, but we kept a couple of them here as well to be animal ambassadors. And Hugo was brought to us as a baby, or caught as a baby when she was very, very tiny, and brought here as an animal ambassador for educational purposes as well. So,
I believe she's from the Francois Lake area.
And garter snakes aren't an animal. I've had people ask me a lot, especially because they're so common here. You can find garter snakes, especially the red-sided variety, all over Prince George and the surrounding, throughout the Caribou region. You can find them all over Canada, basically. They're the most common snake here. But people will often ask me if they can just take home garter snakes as pets for their kids. That is not a good idea at all, especially in BC. They are actually considered a protected species, and you can get in trouble for that if they're not being used for an educational purpose or for conservational purposes. So it definitely isn't something I would recommend to just go find a garter snake and keep it. If you find them outside, it's cool to be able to look at them and check them out and stuff like that. But moving them or taking them into captivity, unless you are, for example, like a field researcher or somebody who is involved with fish and wildlife or conservation, I would definitely not recommend doing that, just because you don't want to be able to disturb the snake and make it so that that snake is no longer able to survive in the wild on its own, or to cause any detriment to the population of wild snakes that does exist here. So you definitely have to be careful with what you're doing.
And there's a variety of different kinds of garter snakes.
There are. So these guys are often called a checker variety, just because of the pattern that exists on their skin. And they kind of have a little bit of variation. Like you'll notice that Bubba and her brothers have a little bit more of a yellow color to them, whereas Hugo is a little bit more gray. But generally this is what they look like. The red-sided ones tend to have a yellow stripe that goes down the center of their body, and then they will have red spots on the sides and a black base color. They'll also usually have red markings on their heads as well. And those guys tend to get quite a bit bigger than the wandering garter snakes here.
So I have another question here for you from Shannon. She says her son would like to know how they move.
That's a great question. Maybe we can get a close-up of that. Let's
Sure.
see. Hugo's big, and she always gives a good example of locomotion for snakes just because she's super active. So if you watch the snake's body move across my hands, you'll actually be able to see her scales on the bottom. I'm trying to make sure I can show.
I'm going to try and zoom down here.
Yeah, maybe just show. So you will actually be able to see the scales on the bottom of her stomach kind of moving, especially as she goes over my hand here.
It's tough to get it on the
Yeah, it is.
the camera.
Especially when they're small snakes like these. But basically, these scales on the bottom of her stomach are much larger. They're long and skinny instead of being small and triangle shaped. And the reason for that is that she's able to actually stick these out sort of like a tread on a tire, and that can help her move if she's trying to go across a slippery surface. Or she can flatten them out. She can flatten them out so they're nice and smooth like they are now, and that allows her to go across rough surfaces quickly. So she can actually move these scales independently using her muscles that go all the way down her body. So that's part of how she moves. And also you'll notice that they will push up against things and they will wind, what's called side winding, so that's part of their locomotion. But the main thing is the muscles in their sides can actually be pulled in and out, sort of like an inchworm. They kind of pull themselves along, and they use the scales on the bottom of their stomach, almost like a bunch of little feet, to be able to climb over things.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I know sometimes we see them climbing up the glass on their tank too.
They are super agile snakes, garter snakes. They're also super active. We mentioned before in our last video that they are diurnal, whereas a lot of snakes are nocturnal. So they're really cool to be able to watch during the daytime. And yeah, these guys can, up against a flat surface, they can stretch almost their entire body length. So they can reach almost to the top of their terrarium from the ground. And sometimes they will fall over. The kids call them windshield wipers because they'll go straight up and then they'll slide back down again. But yeah, they'll also hang from their tails and swing across. In the wild, they'll do that going through bushes and things like that. And here you'll see them doing it. They'll swing from the branches of driftwood that are in their enclosure, or they'll swing from the cords that are in there for their heat pad and things like that. So
George is asking, how long do they live?
that's a great question, George. So in the wild, garter snakes only live about 2 years on average because they fall victim to predation. They get eaten by lots of different animals. Also, they sometimes get squished or run over. Things happen to them because they're not very big, and often people will step on them either by accident or on purpose because they think that they're pests. But in captivity, these snakes can live 10 or 20 years. 15 is a good average for garter snakes in captivities, but I've heard of them living more than 20 years. So
Wow.
they definitely live a lot longer if you keep them safe than they do out in the wild.
They're well fed in here, that's for sure.
They are. And Hugo here is the oldest of our bunch, and she's doing really well. So, and because we've mentioned before how they are indeterminate growers, if you ever find a garter snake out in the wild that is very, very large, it's probably a pretty old snake. Like I said too, the red-sided snakes tend to get a little bit bigger than the checkered variety, but generally the larger the snake that you find, that probably indicates that it's a female as well, because as we've seen here with ours, the females are much bigger than the males. So generally if you find one that's got a large body to their head ratio, then that is a female. The males, their heads tend to look a little bit bigger compared to their bodies, and their bodies are quite small, and they generally don't reach this size. A male red-sided perhaps would reach this size, but again, his head would be bigger in comparison to his body.
Right.
Another thing you can do if you are trying to tell the gender of a snake that you have found is, if you look at the bottom of their tails here, you'll see they have a vent scale partway down, which is basically their butt. It's also called the cloaca. The distance between this scale and the tip of their tail will indicate as well. So if it's shorter like this and it doesn't, she doesn't have a lot of length and it tapers off immediately after the vent, which indicates that she is a female, whereas the males will have a longer space between the tail and the vent.
Another question from Donalda, how do they defend themselves?
Great question, Donalda. So oftentimes when you find a garter snake in the wild, the first method of defense that they will have is, here, I'm just going to grab another male to feed. Ooh, come here, crazy eye. They're always trying to escape.
That's what they do.
The first defense mechanism that these guys will use in the wild is to just try and get away. They'll flee the scene, they'll scurry away, they'll hide underneath of something, and they're very quick, so usually that is enough. If you manage to pick them up, or if a predator does get a hold of them at that point, they'll musk you, which is basically similar to how a skunk will spray you with a bad smell if they're trying to defend themselves. except it does come from their cloaca, and people often think that they are peeing or pooping on you, and it kind of, because it does, it smells really bad, and it comes from where the pee and the poop comes from as well. But it is actually a chemical compound that's meant to ward off predators, similar to what a skunk uses, or what our vinaigrette uses. It's just their own chemical compound, so it does not smell good, and I have read that it also tastes really bad and hurts if it gets in your eyes, so that's definitely good enough for them to be able to defend themselves. They rarely bite as a defense mechanism. Usually if you get bit by a garter snake, it's because they think you're food. But if you do pick up a wild snake and it has tried musking you and it has tried squiggling out of your hands and you still don't let it go, then they will proceed to try and give you a bit of a gnaw. So let's get you a...
Now you used a word I didn't recognize there, cloaca?
Yeah, the cloaca. So
Cloaca?
basically a cloaca is, with reptiles and amphibians as well as birds, they only have one exit, so to speak. So their eggs, their poop, their pee, all of that, or their babies if they give live birth. What's going on over there?
I dropped the camera.
It's getting dramatic over here. Here you go, Arms.
So everything comes out of that vent area. that you
Everything
were
comes
showing
out of
us.
there. So just like if you've seen bird poop, it's kind of the pee and the poop are mixed together. The white would be the uric acid, which is their urine. He's biting onto the tongue.
Oh, there we go.
Thinks it's all part of the food. Yeah, so the cloaca or the vent is where basically everything that comes out of their body comes from. And I often use the term vent because that's just easier to say, especially for like younger audiences. They can repeat it back to me. But cloaca is the scientific term, and that's just their main exit, I guess. And with birds and reptiles, it's just the one hole, similar to how dinosaurs work. They had a cloaca, they didn't have separate parts.
Oh, interesting. Now that was quick. He liked that pinky mouse.
He did. He might want another one.
He was clearly not interested in fish, but pinky mice? Whole different story.
Yeah, and like it definitely depends on the snake. They will have their preferences, and it also depends on the day. Sometimes they want the fish right away, and sometimes they completely ignore them. So you can see Hugo, she really loves fish. She's a big fan, but when I first started feeding Hugo fish, she had no idea what was going on. And it took her quite a long time. She didn't clue into the fact that the fish were food until Bubba started eating them, and then she was right on that. So.
Oh, interesting. And they're not having any trouble getting these down, even though they've been taking them in backwards. He ate the last two feet first.
Yeah. With the larger prey items, like we were talking about with Rio, they really need to eat them from the head down. Otherwise, it will kind of get folded up and stuck. I have seen them eat rats that way, but it takes a really long time, and they don't go down very well. But with the pinkies, they're so soft and gelatinous. Their bones haven't hardened yet, so they're mostly cartilage on the inside. And they can kind of just fold them up and squish them in. Are you down, Arms? He's going to try and bite me, I think. Oh, maybe not. Good boy.
He should be pretty full.
Yeah, you can actually see it here. If you hold him this way, you can see how much his scales are sticking out right now where he just
Oh, yeah, where the lumps are.
So, you don't want to handle them too much after they've eaten, just because you don't want them to regurgitate the food.
Right.
Garter snakes aren't as likely to do that, just because they eat smaller prey items, and they're often used to eating a small prey item and then fleeing the scene of the crime, so to speak, just so that they don't become a vulnerable prey item themselves. Here's another one for you. Want one? This one's legs here. Arms is the smaller one that we just showed.
Legs definitely wanted that.
Here we go.
Frank is asking, hey Frank, how's it going? Frank's
Miss
asking.
you, Frank. The snakes miss you.
I can't believe Frank's watching snakes.
I can't believe it.
For
must
those
be
of you who
really
know
good.
Frank, he drives our vans and our train. He does all sorts of things in here, but he's off at home with the rest of our team. So Frank wants to know how often you have to feed them.
That's a great question, and I'm surprised that you would even want to ask.
Frank has a problem with our snakes.
You must be getting really bored at home, Frank. No, these guys are awesome. You got to come around. So these guys in the wild, they'll eat. They're opportunistic feeders, so they will just eat as much as they can, as often as they can, which isn't always the best, especially in captivity when they're not going to be forced to go for a long time without food. They don't need to gorge like that. So we try to feed them smaller amounts more frequently than, say, a larger body snake like Rio. Rio eats about every 2 or 3 weeks because he eats a lot at once, and that's how ball pythons generally just are supposed to eat. Garter snakes can eat every day, but it's probably not the best. It can cause digestive problems if you're overfeeding them, or they could end up struggling with obesity or something like that. So we feed them every 2 to 3 days usually. I try to feed them every 3 days. Sometimes if they eat a smaller prey item, then I can feed them more often, but I generally keep it between every 2 or 3 days.
Well, they're a pretty interesting group that we've got in here. It's always fun to hang out with the garter snakes.
The garter snakes are definitely some of my favorite snakes, and I think people often find garter snakes boring just because they're all over the place, but that's part of what I love about them is that because they're so adaptable, they can exist in such a wide variety of environments that if you're, like I've seen videos of garter snakes up in Alaska going through the snow, which isn't something that's obviously typical of a snake. They usually would be underground at that point, and most snakes wouldn't be able to survive if you were to put them in the snow, but garter snakes are a whole nother ballgame. They can withstand extreme cold and extreme heat, so you'll find them all the way down into Mexico. And there's lots of different color varieties as well. There are red, green, blue, yellow, orange. I've seen albino garter snakes. There's lots of different kinds of garter snakes, so they're just really interesting. And also the live birth is super cool, and the fact that they're such a well-mannered colibrid. Even when you find them in the wild, they're such agreeable snakes. I just think that they're awesome.
So I have a question from Royce. He would like to know, how hard do they bite?
So it depends on the size of the snake for sure. Garter snakes in general can't actually cause any damage with their bites. They might draw blood if it was a very large snake. Hugo, for example, or Bubba, our larger female snakes, could probably draw blood if they bit you. They both nipped me a couple of times when I was feeding them, but they've never drawn blood on me or anything like that. It feels like getting pinched with sandpaper when you get bit by a garter snake. It sort of just feels like a bit of pressure, but they don't, as you can see, they have very small mouths, so they don't have a lot of jaw strength for that. They're meant to be able to catch small prey. They aren't meant to be able to gnaw on large animals like us. So when they do bite, it doesn't feel great, but it sort of just feels like a little pinch. It's not super bad or anything like that. Some people, if they do break the skin, will get a reaction from that venom that comes from that gland in the back of their mouth that we were talking about earlier. Usually if you do get any kind of reaction at all, it would be sort of similar to a mosquito bite. So you would get itchy wherever they bit you, and you might get a bit of a welt or a little bit of a red like discolor to your skin, but it doesn't last long and it's totally harmless.
Well, I think we have probably talked about garter snakes for long enough today. These guys are going to want to head back to their tanks.
They probably have, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. If anybody has any questions that we haven't answered for them, I'm assuming, Sabrina, you'd be happy to go online and answer any questions
I
in the
certainly
comments?
would. I've been trying to check the comments on all the live feed videos, so if anybody does have any, just leave your questions in the comments, or any of your comments that you just want to share with us, something that you might have to share about garter snakes. I mean, people find them in the wild all the time, so I've had kids who come in to visit them, and I've heard lots of interesting stories from grandparents and parents and children alike, so they're definitely a super neat snake that most people will recognize when they see them.
That's great. Well, thank you again, and thanks everybody for tuning in, and we will be back here with Headkeeper Sabrina again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. So enjoy the rest of your day, and stay safe and stay healthy, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.